started. Now, hopefully. Brilliant, we're going to get started now. May I say you're all doing very well with being so awake at this time on a Sunday morning for the last day of Tom Johnson. So hopefully we'll keep the energy up for what I think is going to be one of the most interesting panels of the weekend. When I was coming in, somebody said to me, "Is this the one where we're going to talk about crushing capitalism?" And I said, "Yes." So get your ass inside because we're going to talk about it. I'm going to just introduce our speakers here who are very qualified to talk on this subject. Our first up is Dr. Aoife Ní-Luchtlann. Aoife is a policy analyst with the independent think tank TASC. She writes policy and proposals in a range of areas, mainly on economic and social policy. Her recent areas of work include topics on tax justice, the strategic role of state assets, and worker participation on boards. She has a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, and that was in the area of international trade unionism. So I'd like to invite Aoife to the podium to make her speech. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? I'm afraid I'm not going to talk about crushing capitalism. I'm sorry, it's a bit early in the morning for me. I'd just like to thank you for inviting me down here on the topic of challenging capitalism in the broken model. What I am going to talk about is a particular element of capitalism, or at least the form of capitalism we seem to practice here, and our broken model and the effects that has on our own economy and society, but also on the global south. So the topic I'm going to talk about has been simmering for many, many years, but it's recently exploded onto the international political and media consciousness, and that's the issue of tax competition and tax avoidance. So you'll all be very, very familiar with the recent reports, I'm sure, and the ongoing controversy there. So in Ireland, the issue of tax exiles has frequently been debated in the office, the media, public discourse in general, and this is where we've historically kind of concentrated our ire in the area of tax avoidance or evasion. And people, they're very rightly appalled when they realise that fellow citizens are arranging their affairs, arranging their residency in order that they can contribute less to the society and the country that actually gave them their position in the first place. Over the previous decades, the use of tax reliefs in the property sector has led to a very vigorous debate about the effect that this has had on the market and on government revenue. However, while Ireland's tax regime for corporations has received some criticism over the years from domestic sources, you'll find it from the odd trade unionist, the odd politician, not enough, development NGOs and academics, the level of media interest in the topic has now escalated, and I think it's fair to say that it's unprecedented, really. So many of sort of the ongoing criticism of the tax regime, or they questioned whether or not it was fair to tax an employee's income at rates of 20% or over, and the profits of a company or a corporation at a rate of 12.5%, and that, you know, as we know, that's sort of maximum rather than minimum. Other critics, academics and NGOs in particular, questioned whether or not Ireland's tax system could be facilitating multinational companies to avoid paying tax in the global south, thus negatively impacting on countries which desperately needed the revenue. In September 2012, the international development NGO Christian Aid asked TASC to collaborate on a project which aimed to highlight the damage caused by tax avoidance. So at the heart of this project was the idea that tax avoidance hurts all of us, locally and globally, but that some societies are better equipped to deal with the consequences of this than others. We wanted to highlight the link between tax avoidance by multinationals and that which is practiced more locally, albeit on a sort of a more smaller scale. And we wanted to galvanise action really on the issue of local and global tax evasion. That project was called Tax Injustice Following the Tax Trail. I'm afraid I don't have copies with me, but they're on the website. You'll find it on www.tasknet.ie. Small plug, sorry. So within a few weeks of launching our paper, the issue of tax avoidance by multinationals suddenly began to feature quite heavily again in the international press, and Ireland was pretty much always at the heart of this story. The parliamentary committee meetings in the UK and the Senate meetings in the US, which you're probably very familiar with at this point, drove much of this increased interest. However, while we in TASC, we welcome the sustained political and media attack on international tax avoidance, it's really regrettable that most of the focus and commentary has very much been on the damage that this, caused by this antisocial corporate behaviour, the damage has been on rich countries rather than the damage that it has caused to poorer countries, which has taken a clear second place in the discourse. So at this point, it's probably advisable to draw a distinction between tax evasion, which is illegal, and tax avoidance, which we describe as utilising legislation in a manner not intended by the legislature to obtain a tax advantage, or exploiting mismatches in domestic or international law to obtain a tax advantage. And it's this latter angle that puts Ireland on the wrong side of the tax debate at the moment. So who are the winners and losers of this story? Well, that goes back to the point at which you design your tax system. So when you're designing your tax system and you're setting your tax rates, you always produce winners and losers. It has been widely argued that Ireland's tax system is progressive, and to some extent we can say, well, this is true if we look at labour taxes, and if we look at the rates and bands, then we can argue individuals with higher income pay more tax than those on lower income. However, judging the progressivity of a tax system based purely on labour taxes leads to a very incomplete picture. You also have to examine corporation tax, consumption taxes like VAT, and capital taxes. It's also the case that headline rates are not the same thing as effective rates. That means the amount of tax that an individual or company actually pay. Tax expenditures, tax reliefs, tax shelters can significantly reduce a company's tax liability and reduce tax paid by an individual, albeit usually to a lesser extent. The major problem is that the cost of these reliefs can be very hard to calculate. It's difficult to get a good and timely overview of the effective tax paid across a system, as an individual or a company can usually utilise a number of tax reliefs at the same time. So this makes it very, very difficult for both policymakers and critics to really get a grip on who's paying what compared to others and compared to other countries. It tends to lag a number of years behind, and sometimes, in fact, it's very difficult to get good numbers, in particular from multinational corporations. So the legislation governing them tends to be very complex, and it makes it very difficult for tax experts, non-tax experts, sorry. I'm not a tax expert, but we would utilise the expertise of many people who've worked in the revenue and academics to help us in our work, because it's extremely complex and possibly deliberately so. It's very hard for NGOs, and it's very hard for politicians to understand their real application and impact, and this is a very big problem when it comes to decision making in their office. So tax breaks in Ireland, like many countries, we've used a lot of tax breaks extensively in pursuit of particular policy outcomes. There isn't really anything in a way wrong with that. You can find them in agriculture, stock relief, woodlands relief, industry, manufacturing relief, research and development, arts and culture, film relief, social policy, tax relief for creches and nursing homes, and tourism, hotels and holiday cottages relief, and that's just a few, and there are very, very many. So as I mentioned, the cost of tax breaks, that is the loss of income to the exchequer, can be very high. So the question for government and for society is whether the direct and indirect cost of these tax reliefs are justified by the anticipated benefit that will be generated by the tax break. But we must remember that a tax relief is in itself a form of expenditure, and it's a transfer of public resources from society as a whole to an individual or a company who uses them to reduce their own tax liability. So what do they cost us? Well, we can approach this question from a few different angles. We can look at the actual loss to the exchequer due to the use of tax breaks, and you'll be very familiar with this around budget time when politicians say, what is the cost of the rent a room relief, for example. And if we take all of these reliefs, it's generally in the order of millions. But if we look at the wider economic cost, it can be quite devastating. much, much larger than the actual financial cost, if you like. We should also examine the social and environmental costs of our reliance on particular tax breaks. So let's take a very simple one, which is that on private pensions. It's quite controversial, and I know there's a bit of change underway, but I'm going to talk about what the situation is now rather than what it is next year. So the relief for private pensions is still at the higher rate, which means that lower income earners claim back their pension investment at 20%, and those at higher earners claim back 41%. So, you know, we must ask ourselves, is this fair? If we had reduced that tax relief from 41% to 20% in budget 2013, we would have saved in the region of €450 million. That is a really sizable amount. That's €450 million we could have used to decrease the level of cuts in public services or to decrease the level of cuts in the capital budget. So not only does continuing to provide this relief at a higher level mean that we get that we're lowering our tax revenue, it means we have to find savings elsewhere, but it also represents a transfer of wealth from those on lower incomes to higher incomes, because it is paid for from the government revenue to which we all contribute. So 80% of the benefits of pension tax breaks go to the wealthiest 20% of the population. This is an ESRI figure. Therefore, the financial tax cost of this tax relief is in the millions, but the social cost, which you can estimate as the wider cost in terms of having to plug that hole somewhere else in the budget, that's also in the millions. One set of tax reliefs that have had huge economic cost are the property reliefs, and they were very beloved during the years of the Celtic Tiger, and thankfully they have been almost run down. It's generally recognised that these reliefs did huge economic damage. They contributed to the overheating of the property market and the resulting banking crisis. And it isn't hyperbole to suggest that when we are finished counting the cost of the collapse, these tax breaks would have cost us in the billions. But the cost is wider than pure financial and economic. It's also social. As hundreds and thousands of people are living in negative equity, thousands are struggling to pay their mortgages. This huge social and human cost occupies a very large space in our public discourse. The environmental cost is also recognised, but really to a lesser degree. While the original intent of these reliefs may have been to provoke development in areas where it was badly needed, dilapidated urban centres, for example, and to promote tourism in specific areas where it was needed, they've led to undesirable development, damage to the hotel industry, and they represent a continuing drain on the taxpayer. They've also led to the phenomenon of the ghost estate, which blights our environment and distorts our development pattern. This will have a continuing impact on our ability to promote sustainable development and to tackle climate change. Nowhere is this more evident than the Upper Shannon Basin area. So this relief was introduced in 1998, and it covered counties Longford, Roscommon, Leitrim, Cavan and Sligo, and it covered commercial, industrial and residential properties. It allowed for 100% of the construction of the premises, which meant that the taxpayer picked up 41% of the construction bill. So combined with extremely lax and irresponsible planning by councils, these reliefs led to the environmentally destructive overdevelopment of this area. If we look at the number of ghost estates per 100,000 countrywide, Leitrim, Longford, Cavan, Sligo and Roscommon top the list. Leitrim has 44 vacant houses per 1,000 households. Longford has 42 vacant houses per 1,000 households. Mayo, on the other hand, which is very nearby, has 10 vacant houses per 1,000 households. Galway has 9, Offaly has 8, I think Dublin City has about 9. Dublin South County Council, on the other hand, has something like 16. It's quite variable across the country, but you will find that the Shannon Basin area tops the league here. So what relevance do these tax breaks have for the issue of tax avoidance if they're being used for the purpose in which they were prescribed, really, which was to spur on development in specific regions? Well, tax breaks are often referred to as tax shelters, so the clue's in the name. It was possible for individuals and companies literally to shelter money from taxation through the use of these schemes, and this is why they were so popular, really. An ad for holiday homes in Waterford can really show this, and it goes as follows. The 48 luxury turnkey holiday houses at Waterford Castle Lodges, the island, Waterford, all qualify for capital allowances in the respect of qualifying expenditure, provided certain conditions are met. This means that up to 700,000 of taxable rental income can be sheltered. resulting in a tax saving of up to $326,000 to the purchaser. So it's clear the market they're aiming for there, they're actually advertising shelter, tax shelter, rather than development. We can also see this with the film relief. Let's say, and I have this outlined if you need, it's quite a complex procedure and it's outlined in our report, which is available, as I said, on the internet, but I'll give it a go anyway. So let's say an individual borrowed €33,000 in order to make an investment of $50,000 in a film production. The film does not have to turn a profit in order for the individual to make money. Through using the tax break at 41%, if the film breaks even, that is, doesn't make a profit, the individual can make a net gain of €4,000. This means that even though the investment does not make a profit, the individual can lessen their tax bill by €4,000. All they need is a clever tax advisor and sufficient funds to take out a loan in the first place. So what is the connection between tax avoidance at the global level and the use of tax breaks to either shelter money or reduce your tax bill at the domestic level? Well, the reliance on the tax system, reliefs, allowances, exemptions, etc., to encourage foreign direct investment to Ireland is not very dissimilar to the use of the tax system to encourage domestic investment in property development or film. A friendly tax environment has been the central part of the effort to lure multinational corporations to Ireland. Foreign direct investment of this nature has been at the core of successive government industrial policy for over half a century, and this policy is generally regarded, up until now at least, to have been successful. The Irish tax system is a key component of a subsidiary-based structure that drastically reduces the overall tax bill of transnational businesses, and this is really what we've been seeing in the past few months in the reports from the UK and from the US. Most of those, those hearings and committees tend to focus on companies which were in the digital area, so they're dealing with intellectual property. Google, Facebook, Apple, also Starbucks, which claimed, I think, that the roasting of coffee beans was intellectual property, and this is the way in which they were able to avoid tax in the UK through funneling it through Switzerland. So it's an interesting take on that. But throughout all of these discussions, the place of Ireland in the tax dodging activities of many of these countries was central. The IFSC, the International Financial Services Centre, plays a central role in this system. It has the dubious honour of having a government-sponsored lobbying committee, which the government has thankfully agreed to reappraise. While Ireland is not one of the major centres for financial services, such as London, New York, Frankfurt, it's currently home to around 40% of the world's hedge fund assets. And if you think about that, 40% of the world's hedge fund assets are sitting on the docks in Dublin. It has also provided a home to what are known as brass plate companies, which you'll have heard of. That is a company which is registered in Ireland but have little or no employees or fixed assets. They exist merely to shift profits, loans, losses from one arm of a subsidiary in one country to another arm in another country. And this is done to reduce global tax liability. Profit switching transfer pricing, or transfer pricing for short, is the process by which multinationals transfer goods and services to different parts of the company. Simply put, subsidiary A buys goods or components of goods from subsidiary B, which is located in another country, paying for these goods with very low prices, sometimes below cost. Subsidiary A is located in a low tax country, such as Ireland, and then uses these goods in a production process. They then sell the output to company C, which is another subsidiary based in another country, and they sell that at a very high price. Companies B and C sell at very low prices and buy at very high prices, so they make little or no profit at all. Therefore, they pay no tax. Company A, on the other hand, makes all the profits, and as Company A is registered in a low tax country such as Ireland, it pays less tax than it would have done if it had funneled its money through Company B or Company C with higher taxes. While Google and Apple may be the most famous current cases, they are not necessarily the most shocking. As I said earlier, tax avoidance and evasion afflicts all countries, but some have a better capacity to administratively tackle the problem and deal with the economic and social consequences. Earlier this year, ActionAid, an international development NGO, published a report on the activities of a company called Associated British Foods. You may know Associated British Foods from Ryvita, Tetley Tea, but it also owns Pennies, so it has been in the news for another reason, also very nasty reason recently, which is the collapse, I think, of the sweatshop in Bangladesh. The ActionAid report focused on the company's activities in Zambia, particularly its Zambian subsidiary, Zambia Sugar plc. ActionAid estimated the Irish subsidiary deprives the Zambian government of $2 million a year, and that is equivalent to €1 for every €14 of Irish development aid to Zambia since 2007. Now, this is a country where 45% of children are undernourished. How is it able to do this? Well, Ireland has a bilateral tax treaty with Zambia, which dictates the level of tax which Zambia is allowed to levy on the transfer of goods, services, interest and loans between the subsidiary in Zambia and South Africa and its subsidiary in Ireland. This was negotiated many years ago, but it is heavily stacked against Zambia. As I mentioned earlier, tax avoidance or tax dodging is a problem common to many, if not most, countries. A recent report by the Tax Justice Network suggests that through exploiting cross-border tax rules, the global super rich have hidden at least £13 trillion pounds sterling in secretive jurisdictions such as the Cayman Islands. They've been helped in this by specialised tax accountants, lawyers and private banks. Through these acts of tax dodging, £13 trillion pounds sterling, that's the total of the US and Japanese GDPs put together, has been lost to the global economy. And while this presents a problem to nearly all states, some countries are more vulnerable to tax avoidance and evasion than others. Can I keep going? Sorry. The damage caused to the global south by tax dodging can be demonstrated through some simple figures that are contained in the Tax Justice Network report, which I think you can find on their website as well. It's a very good website. I encourage you all to take a look at it. Since the 1970s, 139 low to middle income countries have lost a total of $7.3 to $9.3 trillion to tax dodging by the super rich. So this sum is more than enough to cover the debts of these countries, whose aggregate gross external debts stood at $4.8 trillion in 2010. So tax dodging on this scale greatly hinders the capacity of these countries to pay these debts, to develop their economies, and to pay for public services that they badly need. Between 2005 and 2007, Christian Aid estimates that 6 Irish aid programme countries lost nearly €82 million in tax revenue to EU or US, the EU countries or the US, not specifically Ireland. Almost 17% of the Irish aid budget for those countries concerned. So that's an awful lot of money flowing out while we're attempting to put money back in. Another risk is that countries in the global south may look to countries such as Ireland, which they see as being very successful in bringing in foreign direct investment, and they may seek to adopt similar measurements and tax arrangements. So what do we think of this? Well, the IMF, the World Bank and the OECD, not socialist organisations, have all highlighted the risk to countries in the global south posed by the use of tax breaks to encourage multinational companies from the global north to invest in the tax incentivised countries rather than other countries or their neighbours. They argue that in negotiating with multinationals and agreeing tax breaks, governments are facilitating a race to the bottom, which does not benefit the region, but the multinational investors. Shouldn't we be applying this to Ireland? Is Ireland not partaking in a race to the bottom? Is Ireland not the leader in this case in terms of tax competition and tax incentivisation? So the question is then, is Ireland a tax haven? And you have to be very careful when you ask this question in Ireland because people can get very, very upset. It has huge negative connotations for Ireland's reputation if we were to say that Ireland is a tax haven. Perhaps companies would not want to deal with us, and certainly our major investors in the US and the EU would not be very happy. Well, the good news is we're not listed as a tax haven by the OECD, but then very few countries are. Many people have labelled Ireland as a tax haven. You will recall the US Senate report did that quite recently. And that's because it possesses the following qualities: low corporation tax, ease of incorporation, light touch regulation, and successive governments extremely keen to encourage foreign direct investment. Tax avoidance and tax evasion are antisocial acts, and they strike at the state's ability to collect and allocate resources to meet the needs of its people. When individuals or companies avoid or evade paying their fair share of tax, they undermine the state's capacity to provide for schools, roads, hospitals, and other public services. They also place an extra burden on those citizens and companies who do pay their fair share of tax. And this holds for countries in the global north and countries in the global south. Accommodating multinational companies has come at a cost. Some commentators have argued that the obsessive focus on foreign direct investment is likely to hinder the development of indigenous firms in Ireland. The recent spike in media attention, in particular the scrutiny being brought to bear by the US Senate, the UK Parliament, EU countries such as Germany and France, is extremely damaging to our reputation. But more important is the negative effect it has on equality, economy, the environment. An industrial policy which is over-reliant on the tax system and tax incentives to draw in investment will not promote a more equal society and economy. If we want high-quality public services, good welfare system, and more equal society, then we must ensure that everyone, including multinationals, pay their fair share. There can be no special treatment for the rich or for Apple. We must ensure that our taxation system is not contributing to the impoverishment of the people in the global south. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Aoife. I'll now introduce our second panellist to discuss this topic, Bill Kelly. In 2011, Bill helped establish Metal Midwest to promote the Mondragon Cooperative Cooperation business model in Ireland. In 2010, at the Limerick Institute of Technology Enterprise Acceleration Project, he helped in the development of the Sustainable Cooperative Social Business Model. He's also been involved in the setting up of the Speakers Corner in Limerick, a platform for city centre debate on topical issues of a social and political nature. And he's a former telecoms engineer with Technomin Limited Shannon, where things took a bit of a change of direction for Bill in 2009 when the company made 60% of its workforce redundant and the jobs were lost to India in that case. So I'll ask Bill now to take the platform and give us his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be here in Cork again. Somebody said earlier about smashing capitalism. Right? There's no point, in my view, in smashing it or replacing it unless you've got something to replace it with, and even more importantly, a strategy within which to implement it. So, I'll talk briefly about tax havens and then go on to possible way forward. Irish light touch capitalism. It is speculative, it is predatory, and it is exploitative. Speculative, we need only look at the change in house prices in Celtic Tiger era and the subsequent drop. Predatory, we need only look at the pensions in the private sector, how they have been decimated. And exploitative, in the ever-increasing numbers of us that are being shoved towards slave labour status, pushed into the poverty trap, with more and more of our wages and our salaries being consumed beyond our control. So that's in very general broad brush strokes, but the practical effects of it on the ground, in the Irish tax haven in 2013, we have at risk in terms of poverty and deprivation, we have 16% at risk of poverty. These are CSO figures. Deprivation rates 24.5%. That is individuals at risk of at least two forms of deprivation, and consistent poverty rates of 6.9%, effectively 7%. Average wage at the moment has decreased to 35,700. Average industrial wage has decreased to 41,800. These are 2012 figures. And the cost of living is amongst the highest in the EU. We also have, in terms of immigration, since 2008, 308,000 have emigrated. Of those, approximately half, 150,000, are native born. And the figures peaked in 2011, 87,000 emigrated. It is reasonable to assume that at least 50% of those who've emigrated, of that 308,000, are involuntary emigration. It should be said that voluntary emigration, seeing the world, etc., is fantastic, and along with that class. But when our ministers repeatedly get up and talk in terms of immigration not being so bad, it is a damning indictment of our society and of our little republic. Charlie Haughey used to say that the North was a failed political entity. But with these sort of numbers emigrating, we really have to ask ourselves a very fundamental question. When I was the age of the average person here, Bob Geldof brought out his what was it, Banana Republic, and I took umbrage at Geldof's thing. Banana Republic. But the years rolling on, Geldof was right. Geldof was right. Jack Lynch used to say, if unemployment figures hit 100,000, that he would resign. Well, they actually hit 100,000 when he was teaching, but he didn't resign. But that gives you an idea of what problems happening, right? Unemployment at the moment, the government had it down at 15%. The Troika were here 3.5 weeks ago on their latest report. And the Troika said that when you take out all the window dressing, the little schemes the government has, and you measure the unemployment statistics by their standard international models, rules, it comes out at 23%. And we're thinking we're better than Spain with official 23%. And that is before you factor in the enforced immigration. And people tell me we're not a banana republic. So that is the Irish tax haven of 2013. Those poverty levels, those immigration levels. So you'd ask the question, light touch capitalism in our tax haven, why does its hegemony remain virtually unchallenged? Now, we've all heard the recent talk in the States about Apple and others, but why does its hegemony remain unchallenged within Ireland? With the exception of Task and one or two others, right? We have to ask ourselves who benefits from it. Looking at the International Monetary Fund, again, not necessarily, I wouldn't be regarded as friends of the left, but their Coordinated Direct Investment Survey for Ireland of 2010 shows Ireland direct outward investment to Bermuda of 73 billion. This is dollars. Now, you probably can't see it on your hand there, it's quite small, but you can send anybody the chart, we'll put it up on the website and you can see it. Right? These are the sort of monies that we're sending to Bermuda, the tax haven. We are also a tax haven. So the beneficiaries, obviously the multinational corporations. We're all familiar with the names, obviously. But also the IFSC brass plate companies, the banks, Irish and foreign loans. But who are the foot soldiers of the multinationals who organise the tax havens? They are the large accounting houses and the large law firms. Senior civil servants, some. And some governments. So, if we continue down the road that we're going, things can only get worse. And I would argue that this government should not be allowed to do to society what a former government did to Bridget McCall. I presume most of you do remember Bridget McCall and what happened to her in the Bum Donegal. But the prolonged over-reliance on FDI as an economic development model has elevated light touch regulation and the tax haven culture to sacred cow status in Ireland of 2013. It could be argued that the financial services industry has captured the Irish economy with the willing compliance of our political class, who happily don the green jersey in stoic defence of our soggy, boggy tax haven. John Bruton, former Taoiseach and now chairman of the IFSC, lamenting the over-regulation of the IFSC, not at the crash, but as late as May 2013. He said as follows: "We need to put a rein on regulation." Right? This now is former Taoiseach, current chairman of the IFSC, and his job is to go around the globe promoting the IFSC, the brother of the Minister for Industry and Enterprise. Right? In Labour people in your government, right? FDI, the job creation figures in FDI are static over the last 10 years. 140,000 directly employed. These are the IDA their own figures. With the advent of the financial transaction tax and the CCCTB, the combined corporation tax, those figures will probably won't grow. The government's response, of course, instead of investigating and piloting other economic development models which can coexist with FDI, instead they have pursued the Connect Ireland initiative, whereby citizens are invited to help the IDA bring more tax haven FDI into the country. The financial transaction tax, I'll read from a recent NAMA report on it. It reads as follows, it's very brief. It says, although Ireland has opted out or not to sign up for FTT, and while primary bond issuance by sovereigns are exempt, the tax will be levied on routine secondary market dealings in Irish bonds by firms in the EU, EU11, reducing their liquidity and adding to the cost of funding. The NAMA spokesman said. The EU11, the other members of the Euro, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Slovenia, Estonia, Belgium, Greece, Austria and Slovakia, they've all signed up for the financial transaction tax. So the EU is enabling member states who want to introduce the tax under the enhanced cooperation procedure. So the tax is coming in anyway. NAMA are suggesting, sorry, I said NAMA and the NTMA, my apologies. They are saying that it will affect us. So the tax is here and it's here to stay. So the pressure from the EU and the US and the USA will continue in terms of the Irish tax haven. In the EU, the Common Consolidated Corporation tax base has been under discussion for 15 years plus. Now it has been largely ignored by Ireland until very recently, because by the terms of EU bailout, we are obliged to take part in meaningful discussions on the CCCTB. And as we now know, the financial transaction tax is also going to hit as well. Good news, I would suggest, for those of us who want to see the end of the tax haven model. Also, the Senate Permanent Committee of Investigations in the USA, Senators Carl Levin and John McCain, these people haven't gone away. Them and more likely will continue to pressure the tax haven model. So we could ask ourselves, are we witnessing the end of the beginning for the Irish tax haven economic development model? Perhaps, but it's only the end of the beginning. I would argue that the corporate tax haven model becomes acceptable when states, or when this state perhaps, taxes its own citizens at 12.5% and provides additional facilities whereby citizens can further reduce their tax take to 0 to 2%. In other words, sauce for the goose should be sauce for the gander. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should pay tax at 0 to 2%, but we should levy appropriate taxes on the multinationals. So, what might an alternative look like? And one possible alternative might be as follows. The industrial urban cooperative model is worthy of investigation and adaptation. I mentioned a word of caution here. in the Irish environment. The Irish agricultural cooperative model has transitioned in large measure to the PLC route, where maximising returns for external shareholders is a primary driver. We should look beyond that. There are other successful cooperative models where maximising returns for community and creating sustainable employment are the primary drivers. A good place to start our search, I would suggest, is the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation model. Now, we're not necessarily saying that cooperatives are a panacea to all our ills, but they are one possible tool to be investigated. I'll briefly run through a comparison which will highlight the essence of what we are about. I'll do a comparison between Ireland and the Basque Country in northern Spain. Population, Ireland between 4 and 5 million, the Basque Country 2.5 million. Historically, we've had civil unrest in terms of, let's say, trouble in the north, and they have something not dissimilar in terms of ETA. Current unemployment, we are 15%. The Troika say we are 23%. In Spain, generally, they are 23%. In the Basque Country, they are 7.8%. 7.8% verifiable. In the 1950s, when the Irish state, with some justification, it should be said, embarked on the foreign direct investment model, the foreign-owned and controlled enterprises. In the Basque Country, they started an initiative for cooperative development, urban industrial cooperative development, locally owned and controlled business, manufacturing. In the year 2000, we had in Ireland 140,000 people employed in FDI. They had 70,000 in the Basque Country employed in the cooperative worker-owner model. Of our 140,000, 90,000 of those, approximately two-thirds, are employed by American FDI multinationals. Roll on 10 years, 11 years in fact, and we still have in Ireland 140,000 employed FDI, 90,000 of which are USA, and in the Basque Country the cooperatives are now up to 83,000, largely worker-owner. A very good example, we invited Microsoft to Limerick there in 2011. 2012, then a group of 18 of us went out to Microsoft, or went out to Mondragon. And while we were touring the plants out there, they showed us their research laboratories. They're very big into industrial research out there. And one of the partners that they collaborate with is Microsoft. And I thought, I wonder how this pans out. Well, they quickly pointed out to us, no, Bill, they said, it's not like Microsoft in Ireland. In the Basque Country and in Spain, Microsoft don't get €1 in grant aid and they pay full tax. It is collaborative research. Whereas if you look at what we do here, we give them grant aid and they pay pretty much no tax. Well, relatively speaking, very little tax. In terms of the workforce, whereas FDI gives us employees, the cooperative model gives us worker-owners. The FDI model gives us competitive self-interest in terms of wages and enumeration, whereas the cooperative model, as practiced in Mondragon and in some other cooperatives, gives fixed differentials between top and bottom. Averaging at the moment of 4-1 between top and bottom. Very good example of how this pans out. If you look in Ireland, pre the crash, the CEO of AIB was getting 3.5 million between salary and votes. Now that's now down to $500,000. Mondragon Bank, the cooperative bank, which has 240 billion under administration, a sizable bank in anybody's language, and a bank which has not been involved in any, has not been in receipt of any state funds, a solid bank. Their chief executive is there, inclusive of bonus, is on 120,000 euros. And that figure was confirmed to us by the Director of Cooperative Dissemination in Mondragon, Michael And he gave that figure in his presentation in Limerick. So in terms of philosophically looking at it, in the government's tax haven model, capital is the primary driver, or the primary controller. In the cooperative model, it is labour. Corporate profit maximisation on the FDI model gives way to community wealth creation and sustainable employment creation. The tax haven model in the FDI scenario is replaced with community resilience and industrial research on the cooperative model. But how do they manage to do what they do in the Basque Country? And why do we have such difficulty with industrial cooperatives trying to get them started here? I would argue it goes back to education. In Ireland, you have a complete absence of urban cooperative studies. I would stress again, urban cooperative studies. Whereas in the Basque Country, and indeed in other areas around Europe, Emilia-Romagna and Italy is another good example, they have deeply rooted urban cooperative studies. If you look at our universities, if there is compelling research which can be commercialized, it is almost by default put on the venture capitalist conveyor belt, which implies external ownership most of the time. If you look at the Basques, what they do, they have the cooperative conveyor belt, which suggests local ownership and community ownership. They don't believe in Mondragon that entrepreneurial ability is confined to a handful of people. They believe that just about everybody, given the right encouragement, can be entrepreneurial. So what are others doing? Is it just confined to northern Spain? It's not. This is happening all over Europe and North America. Looking at New York City Council in January put together a program for the promotion of worker cooperatives in New York City. Details over there on your handout. We talk in terms of our banks, our government, your government, Labour people, wants to get AIB back on its feet as quickly as possible and put it back into private ownership. I would suggest they might like to look at the Bank of North Dakota, which is a state-owned bank in the heart of Republican territory in the USA, very successful, set up in 1919. I'll read briefly what the president of the bank said in a recent interview. Their bank was created 90 years ago in 1919 as a populist movement swept the northern plains. Basically, it was a very angry movement by a large group in the agrarian sector that was upset by decisions that were being made in the Western markets, in the money markets, in Indianapolis and New York, deciding who got credit and how their goods got to market. So the movement swept the northern plains in North Dakota. It was called the Non-Partisan League, and they took control of the legislature and created what was called an industrial program, which created the Bank of Northern Dakota as a financing arm for the state-owned mill and elevator to market their goods. That was 90 years ago, and it's still very strong today. It is being held up in the States as a model worth emulating. I would suggest that Labour people here, you could do worse than talk to your people in government about exploring the North Dakota. There are lots and lots of practical examples. And the good thing about some of the American examples, nothing gets lost in translation. Right? There's some very good examples in Britain as well. Very good examples. When we went to Mondragon in late 2011, early 12, we invited Fine Gael and Labour, right? But they weren't prepared to come travel with a bunch of, I suppose, commies they might have thought of it, but they weren't prepared to come out. It's interesting that last year, about this time last year, we made a presentation to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation. And during the course of that presentation, some of the senators and TVs on the panel got irate when I described the country as a tax haven model. And interestingly enough, you roll on 12 months later, and the whole international press was screaming tax haven market. So the question is, what are the government doing, given that we can see the beginnings of the crack in that model, and our partners in the USA and the EU are not going to allow that model to continue in Ireland as it currently is. What is the government doing to put some alternative in its place? And the short answer is absolutely nothing, and that is the crying shame. And I'm not necessarily saying that cooperatives are to be all and end all, but the very fact that we're not, that your government, Labour people, are not looking at alternatives. And I'll leave you this last comment. Remember the government of Dick Spring. We had 33 seats then. You went in on a spring tide, it was called, for those who might be old enough to remember. And the electorate cut you in half, back down to 15 seats, I think, after that, that one term in office. I would suggest, Labour people, that if you don't want to suffer a similar type fate, and you're currently on 9%, that your party would want to be forcing the agenda at government if you don't want to suffer a similar fate. Thank you very much.
In the north, there's a couple of very interesting examples, right? They have, excuse me, they have access to some little bit of EU funding, right? But no, it's primarily driven voluntarily, but they're making some inroads, right? And they also have the cross-community spirit that they're developing as well in the cooperatives, which is great to see. Down south, they were as scarce as hen's teeth. In Limerick, we spent a year doing advocacy and research and stuff like that. And we took a decision there about 2 months ago that it was now time for practical action on the ground. So we're opening a grocery cooperative. We hope to open in July. And to have a practical proposition on the ground, so that people can see a practical manifestation cooperative. It will be a multi-stakeholder cooperative, worker co-op element, community consumer element, built on research which we've done with the Unicorn Worker Cooperative in the States, and some are in Manchester, and some consumer cooperatives in New York that we are liaising with, and we don't see them two or 3 months ago. So the short answer is precious little on the ground, precious little.
And have you tried, I mean, the credit union is kind of seen as a type of cooperative in one sense. Has there been any maybe idea to kind of link in with their success?
Yeah, well, we how would I describe this? I would argue that most people, most members of credit unions are not aware that their credit unions are cooperatives. There's an enormous selling job to be done in the credit union movement about what they actually are, about the vision. Some of them are very well known. Some of them are, as we know, right, from recent reports, leave a lot to be desired. They have a in my view, they have a selling job to do first on the vision. Because if you look at, they're the obvious place for something like this to start. But the very fact that it hasn't speaks volumes, speaks volumes.
Hi, I'm retired, so I'll try to be clear. But my question is, I come from France, and the main argument that we heard from the opposition, I'm a member of the Parti Socialiste in France, and so the main argument we heard from the opposition is that because we have a high level of taxes in France, it's working against the competition and against I would say companies, and the fact that, and it could explain and making a link with the how high rate of unemployment. And obviously I would say, like with the example of Ireland, it's really clear that happening when you have a really low rate of taxes. As you said, you call it like, you could qualify it like a tax haven. So, but you still have a very high level of unemployment as well. So how could you explain that the opposition and the corporate union still explain this kind of linked and argument, like the rate of taxes is linked with the unemployment and the employment?
My own view would be that I'd say two things. The FDI model, when it was brought in the 50s, it was good, but the prolonged over-reliance on it is killing us. And it is not just that large corporations aren't paying their fair share of tax, it's that it distorts the economy completely. And we have a them and us type scenario. We have an apartheid type economy. You're in the FDI model, or you're not. And you know, we have an apartheid health service, an apartheid education system, etc. But it's the cancerous effect of, if you have all your large accounting houses and your large law firms driving the FDI model, and the tax implications of it. And take the bank. AIB is a very good example. Pre-crash, the salary there that was justified. It spills over into the home economy as well. That tax haven thinking, as exemplified in AIB, and it distorts everything. I don't know if that answers your question, but it would be when FDI gets out of control, it has a very damaging effect, not just on third world countries, but I would argue on the home country as well. You know?
If there's something to add.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what you'd say there. I think, as I think I said, that also the over-reliance on FDI and on tax competition isn't really conducive to developing a local and indigenous sector. And there was a survey in, I just have the details here, in 2010 by Ernst & Young, so not exactly some lefty academic or something. And the question was, what was the best way for states to stimulate further European attractiveness? And you would have thought tax rates, tax payments would be top of the list, but in fact it was only at 22%. Above it was support high-tech industries and innovation, and then on top of that support small and medium-sized enterprises, that's 29%. And that's what we've been very, very bad at doing here, comparatively. Our low taxation rate and our very complex system didn't stop Dell from closing down their, the part of their operations that they did in Limerick and shifting it. So there are a lot of reasons why a company will locate somewhere, and some of it is to do with stuff like interconnectivity and location and market and whether there's good access to broadband and things like that, and also the skills and education of the local population. The problem with Ireland is that a lot of, there's a difference between there's a number of things. There's a difference between the FDI that comes into the likes of Google, to be fair to them, and Dell when it was here, and that they are significant employers, and there's no doubt about that. But a lot of the sort of what we were talking about, shenanigans, for want of a better word, they don't employ people. You're talking about companies with sometimes no employees, or 7 or 8, what they call sort of management level or services, and they could be, those 8 people could be an actual subsidiary. So it leads to a very distorted economy, and it's one that you don't have very much control over either, and that's the other problem. There was very little the government could do when Dell decided that they could find cheaper labour elsewhere. The best and the most sustainable way of good, improving your economy, growing your economy is to look at indigenous companies, research and development, and supporting those activities here, and not supporting sort of the transfer of really of capital across borders.
There's one question in the back there.
Regarding FDI and the over-reliance on it, and I think more or less you said that, but just confirm whether you agree with me or not, that it's totally ironic to have us, on the one hand, saying we need to move away from our reliance on property the broadening of the tax base, say, around services and residential property and all that sort of thing. And then at the same time, we're in a position with foreign direct investment, which skews our gross domestic product, GDP, against our gross national product, making it way smaller. They're not comparable. We've got a situation where, because of the controversy with the tax, we're going to have to deal with another hole in our economy. So it's actually ironic, I think, on one hand, to recognise the inadvisability of relying on construction and then repeating it, almost overlapping this type of error in the case of foreign direct investments. Just on the regulation side, people as worthy as Sean Fitzpatrick, who is due in our courts eventually, hopefully to get his deserts, as long as this doesn't go out and prejudice his trial, I'll be happy enough about it. As well as the likes of John Prue, who's an idiot. So we have these people telling us about life regulation. I've been reading Sean Fitzpatrick long before he was infamous, when everybody, he was telling gatherings in his hometown of Greystones in Dublin that we had too much regulation. So we're at it again. We've seen where that got us. And Shawnee also within town, giving them all the money, he was actually dictating terms, trying to dictate terms of the budget to the then budget. So we're in a real mess. We really need to cop ourselves on, and I would say that this gathering is well aware of it, and I would actually suggest to them that they do all possible within the party and in broader society to highlight these absurdities. Thank you. Sorry.
We'll just take the next question and then we'll address both, yeah?
I want to compliment you on your analysis. John Field is my name from the South Leitrim branch. I'm also a member of the Labour Party Policy Committee, so what you said I will definitely be taking on board. How I will manage it is another thing. So agreement on the analysis and the problems, but now the future. I have a personal interest in the cooperative movement. But unfortunately in the Ireland case, and that was really about the Mondragon experiment, as it was called, most impressive. But in Ireland's case, our area cooperative movement was seen very strong on the nationalist line with George Russell. I actually reread his book of 100 years ago on the cooperative movement and the vision he had at the time for the whole cooperative scene. Now, the vision worked to a certain extent, but I think the turning point occurred not very far from here, when at the AGM of Kerry, the cooperative, very successful co-op in Kerry, Brosnan at the time had got quite a bit of coverage. This might have been in the late 60s or early 70s, and he said to the Farmers' Assembly shareholders, if you allow me, turn this company into a limited company, you'll get more money in your shares than you will get in your membership. And he delivered it. Yeah. Very successful. It's no longer, now I know there's some comrades here from Kerry, but it's no longer a food, milk company. More of its profits come from its ingredients. So there was probably an example of a very successful cooperative company. And I don't know that there's any, they're probably up in my area, there probably still is one cooperative, North Connaught Farmers. So that's that side of it. And I wish you the best of luck in your endeavours. In Ireland, a lot of our co-ops, and I'm interested in industrial development myself. I did work for the multinationals as well as with ANCO here, some other organisations. But tended to be in the low-tech area. So I think if we're moving, and the food sector, the shops, that's great. But to really make an impact, I think we have to have cooperative concepts developing in the high-tech sector linked to our universities. You know, there's no doubt about it. We might attack the multi, and I work again, I have a lot of different sins on my back, but I do work for the multinationals, and some of them work very effective. I think we have to be careful on that one. One of my former companies, I work for Intel, they have very strong links with the whole research units in Trinity, with CRAN and nanotechnology. So there have been some benefits. So we have to be very careful here. And I don't want to appear to be making a speech here, so stop me, Chair, if I think I'm going too far. But one time, am I going too far?
A little bit.
Well, I'll finish on one which people, on two if you don't mind. One was, I remember linking up with, giving a talk one time about Ireland's industrial development, or one of these internal company gigs. And this chap came up to me, the Israeli guy from Israel. He says, I'm horrified and amazed. You're letting your whole industrial development being multinational. We have the multinationals. What? We know they're going to leave us. Scud missiles, various other things. So we will develop our own. So they've done the two. Now with a lot of American money. And then, all right, I think we can beat ourselves up as a party in terms of supporting the 12.5%, but and we are officially supporting it. Now, I also want to remind you that Sinn Féin are also there to support the 12.5%. In fact, there's such great support to it, they want it applied to Northern Ireland. Now, the British government is saying no. But that is there. So, if we move away from the 12.5%, we want to have a reasonably good base. Thank you for your input.
Is there a panel in yourself?
Right.
Any responses to that?
I'd say two very brief things. If I may take the second speaker first, if I may. We've decided to put the shop on the high street because it will give us a presence. But you're absolutely right. Core to what we're about is driving up the value chain. There is no point in having cooperatives doing just coffee shops and creches, right? Even though creches are crucially important for all sorts of very fundamental reasons, but it cannot be limited to that. And we, just as in the case of Mondragon, where innovation is key and research is key, we want a presence on the high street so people are aware of the model, and then drive into the university, and then industrial thereafter. In terms of the first speaker, it's actually worse, I think, than you. Sorry, just before I go on to that, we should keep the best of foreign direct investment, but the problem is the prolonged over-reliance on it. That is the key. In terms of the first speaker, it's actually worse than you've outlined, in that we know that GDP is distorted by the multinationals. That it's larger it's made to look larger. The Irish gross domestic product looks a lot larger because of the presence of the multinationals and their export sales and that. So realistically, the homegrown GDP is such, when you factor out the multinationals, it drops down significantly. What has recently come to light is that how the IFSC particularly inflates GNP. And there's a report there, it's only 5 pages, but it's on John Fitzgerald ERSI, it's only out 2.5-3 weeks. Brilliant report. He looks at the money coming into the IFSC, swashing around and going back out, which doesn't deliver any value to the country, but it inflates our GNP. And as he says in the report, what it does is there's a double whammy here, because we pay to Europe our membership fees to the EU. They're based on GNP, which he shows here are inflated. They dropped GNP from 6.1% down to 1.1% when you factor out the IFSC. It's 400 million going to begging that were out of the purse, right? So you can put that to the 400 million that some other speaker was talking about earlier on. But it's a very short report, very concise. So GNP is overinflated as well, you know. So I'll leave it at that, because just in case people are rushing for trains.
Aoife, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, just very quickly, I'm not against FDI, and I'm certainly not against multinationals. My iPhone's sitting there, and my iPod, and my computer, so I'm the same as everybody else. But what I will say is that it's not so much about chasing FDI. We need FDI. We need money coming in, but it's about how we do that, and using our tax system in such a way leaves it open to huge abuses. And it happened on a domestic level, as I was arguing earlier, and it's happening on an international level. And the problem with that as well is that that's not a good enough incentive to stay. When you start engaging in that race to the bottom and that tax competition, everybody loses, because sooner or later, just like cheaper labour, someone is going to come along with better tax rates, lower tax rates, and they're going to have fewer regulations about incorporation. So you have even more Apple with their companies that are non-resident and anywhere by the looks of it. And where does that leave us? In a very bad place. We should be trying to attract FDI and in fact our own domestic resources into industry using other methods, by providing better broadband, by providing cheaper energy, by providing a highly skilled workforce, and all of those things that we can use to grow our economy without engaging in that kind of beggar thy neighbour, race to the bottom kind of enterprise that we have at the moment.
I'd sincerely like to thank both our panellists for giving up their Sunday to come talk to us about this topic. It's a conversation that I know we've had many times in Labour Youth and in the broader Labour Party, and so it's fantastic to just draw on both your experiences in different ways to have that conversation. I think and you both touched upon it, is that it's quite easy to sit around and talk about how the capitalist economic system is exploitative and is inherently unfair, but that there are simple little things that we can do to rein it in as an economic model and try and improve the lives of people by doing that. So thank you both very much for joining us today. Thanks. I just have a brief announcement to make as well. We've been asked by the Shannon Reform campaign, could they have a couple of minutes of our time. So shortly, anybody who's interested, we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back here to hear from someone from that campaign. So that will just be in a couple of minutes. And I'd ask if people could actually keep the break to 10 minutes if they'd like to come back in. I'd just like to say, as Chair of Labour Youth, thank you very much for coming this weekend and joining in the discussion around the Tom Johnson Summer School. I personally think it's the best event that is run by the Labour Party and it's done by Labour Youth. I think it gives us a chance to take stock of where we are as an organisation and to see what things that we can try and achieve over the coming years. And I think from what I took from this weekend was that there were many panellists from very different backgrounds who had examples and concrete examples of how we can, as a political organisation, campaign for improving the lives of people in very difficult situations. I think what we need to take from that as Labour Youth is that we need to be an organisation of action, and that we need to take the examples that they have given and put them into action. So just thank you very much for everyone for coming, and especially to Lisa Connell and Marty O'Prey for organising it, all the party staff for helping in making it a wonderful weekend, such as the lovely Mags and Shawnee. So I'd just like to hand you over now to Lisa Connell, the Director of the Summer School, to formally close. Thank you.
A really quick thank you to everyone again for coming down to Tom Johnson this year, and as everyone knows, Tom Johnson is only what it is because of the contributions that everyone makes during the weekend. Some fantastic speakers that come down every year to talk to Labour Youth, and as Aidan put it, show us how we can move forward as an organisation to progress on socially just issues. Thanks again to Shawnee for the new Twitter type thing we have going on. It was really interesting to see people engaging on the Twitter as a side from the discussion, so that was really great. Also, in Gilmore's speech from last night is on, and saw Miriam and Rory's lovely face on the side, and that's, I think, the link to the video that you can watch and share on Twitter and social media. And thanks again just for everyone for coming down, and I really enjoyed my weekend and I enjoyed talking to everyone.
I do is like the
Colin?